Okay, I believe it's recording on my end.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for confirming. So let's jump right in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 2050 Metropolitan Transportation Workshop Series. I want to pass along our sincerest hopes that all of you are safe and well after Hurricane Milton passed through last week, and that any cleanup or recovery efforts are progressing as smoothly as the situation allows for. That I On behalf of all of our team, we're grateful for you to be able to spend a little bit of time with us today to talk about the 2050 Metropolitan Transportation Plan. For anyone who is unable to attend today's session due to any other cleanup items that are happening or other commitments since we rescheduled this meeting, we are recording this session, as we have with all of our others, and we will publish it directly to our YouTube channel for people to be able to participate and keep up with the information through that medium as well. So, my name is Taylor Laurent, and I'm serving as the 2050 Metropolitan Transportation Plans Project Manager. This 2050 MTP Technical Workshop series serves as our forum for focused and detailed group discussions on technical components of the plan, and we have a wide group of workshop participants here with us today. We have representatives from each of our three counties, Orange, Osceola, and Seminole, as well as our 20 cities and towns, Links, the Florida Department of Transportation, Florida's Turnpike Enterprise, and the Central Florida Expressway Authority, and our three airports, and the Federal Highway Administration. So we have a full agenda today, beginning with discussing the ongoing work efforts to develop the MTP itself, reviewing the regional freight needs assessment recommendations, talking through the integration of health in transportation planning, as well as the housing and transportation strategies for the 2050 plan, followed by an update on the financial resources estimations, and then continuing our discussion on the prioritization process and the draft methodology. These topics will be followed by an open discussion, public comments, and then a review of next steps for the overall long-range plan. Now, we do have a great many people signed into the workshop this afternoon, so I do ask that if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A or chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will be pausing periodically throughout the presentation to answer questions from there. And if you would prefer to ask your question aloud, please use the Raise Your Hand feature, which is also located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will be answering these questions as time permits during the presentation itself. And if we run out of time to address your questions during those brief pauses, we'll return to them during our open discussion period at the end of the meeting. I thank you in advance for your understanding. So without further ado, let's get started. Beginning with an update on our public engagement efforts for the 2050 plan. Now, we've had a handful of recent presentations and outreach events since our last meeting in August, with 10 more events scheduled over the coming months, and likely more to come as we continue to develop the plan and engage with everyone. So far, this has resulted in 60 in-person interactions and 46 surveys completed so far, with additional engagement occurring on our social media channels. So we're excited to already have such a large and robust discussion with the public and to be able to incorporate their thoughts into the overall plan. And we have also continued our coordination with FDOT's Central Florida Regional Planning Model Team. We are in the midst of a secondary review of the base year socioeconomic data for the model, and we will be providing comments back to the model team fairly soon. We expect a similar review of the 2050 Horizon Year data to begin in mid-November once that data is available. Now, the environmental stewardship component of the 2050 plan is something we haven't talked too much about, but we'll have our introduction today and a more detailed presentation coming for you later this year. But this component of the 2050 plan is evaluating how transportation projects impact the environment and the mitigation strategies that we can implement to preserve and protect our natural resources. Since our last meeting, we have completed stakeholder interviews with the agencies listed here on the screen, and we are using their feedback along with the foundations developed through our previous work efforts to craft mitigation and enhancement strategies for the 2050 plan. In terms of our resilience work, a regional risk assessment has been completed with the primary 6 climate hazards of focus, among others, exemplified here on the screen. Strategies that both align with the 2050 plan's goals and objectives and mitigate these hazards are being drafted and evaluated by our team now. So as we continue working with this, you'll see more updates and additional information about this again at your next meeting in December. Something many of our partners have been engaged with over the past few weeks or few months has been our needs assessment. This needs assessment work is nearing its completion, and we have finished reviewing and identifying multimodal transportation needs throughout the region with each of our local agencies through a series of 60 coordination meetings over the past few months alone. We're nearly finished incorporating all of the feedback that we've received, and we will be reaching out one last time to our local agencies, as well as the Florida Department of Transportation, to review the final draft needs list. We have been proactively scheduling these meetings for late October through early November, and we will be asking our local agencies to provide their final thoughts and feedback on that last needs list by November 15th. So we're getting very close to the finish line here, and I think we're all looking forward to that one. So with that, these ongoing efforts do align very well with our overall project schedule, keeping on track and steadily with the plan's development. We are on track to adopt the 2050 plan in December of 2025. So now that we've quickly reviewed all of the 2050 MTP efforts underway, minus the ones we're talking about today, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Mike Williamson to present on the Regional Freight Needs Assessment. Mike?
Great, thanks, Taylor. So the Regional Freight Needs Assessment is a critical part of the MTP update because it's one of the ways we can ensure that your freight industry is being reflected in the needs that we are identifying. Next slide. Today, we're going to spend a few minutes recapping some of what we've heard from our stakeholders across a broad range of folks representing public agencies as well as the private sector. And primarily, that's one of the key ways that we can find out what is on folks' minds today as far as what works well and what doesn't work well about the transportation system. You can see here we've held meetings both in early July and September. I know some of you have been briefed at a previous meeting and may have participated in one of those meetings as well. We also conducted in-person and virtual meetings, follow-up surveys. Thank you for those of you who participated in those. And we also followed up with one-on-one interviews with some of our private partners who were unable to make some of these scheduled meetings. As I mentioned, the participants that we are working with ranged from Florida's Trucking Association, the trucking industry, a variety of economic development folks, some of the modal partners in the region, including the airports and some of the trade organizations. We also engaged with FDOT and a lot of you here on the phone today representing the counties, cities, and some of the other planning partners in Central Florida. Next slide. So we've organized our stakeholder feedback across a variety of topics that we'll go through here today. First one is mobility. So what are folks saying about how well they can move around the region and move their freight throughout the region? There is a recognition that there is worsening congestion and decreased reliability on some of the critical corridors, particularly corridors that provide that first last mile access to the freight facilities. Ongoing safety concerns with some of the roadway design that's out there that makes it difficult for trucks to maneuver. Also, when we look at modal conflicts, we're talking here about things such as where there's heavy truck traffic, as well as a lot of pedestrian or bike traffic, at-grade rail crossings and the like. And then, of course, there's always the concern about reckless driving, whether that be in automobiles or trucks. From an infrastructure standpoint, folks reported that the state roadways are in good condition, particularly when compared to some other states and some other regions that the truck drivers are operating in. I think everybody's been briefed numerous times that the truck parking shortage exists, and it still exists, even though MetroPlan has been actively engaged in partnering to try and advance and has advanced some of these truck parking projects. The significant growth that's taking place in Florida and particularly in Central Florida, there's a recognition that hey, you're doing a great job investing in new roadway capacity, but it's really can't keep pace with how quickly we're growing as a region. A recognition for an ongoing need to improve the connections to some of our freight facilities, and then just a general observation that there really aren't that many rail served properties in the region, which of course impacts the type of companies that you can attract and retain based on the modal choices that they have access to. Next slide. When we look at engaging with our different partners, as I mentioned, that this is feedback from all of the engagement that we've done as part of this update. But certainly, one of the challenges is reaching out and actively engaging with the private sector. And this can be based on availability. It can be based on planning horizons, and a perception on their part that they can affect a long-range planning process. There's a ongoing recognition that we need to balance our freight needs against our community concerns. Some communities that we spoke to were concerned about through truck movements or large trucks moving into residential neighborhoods. And of course, from a freight perspective, our freight partners are forever challenged to make deliveries, particularly with the huge and continued growth in e-commerce, which has vehicles going throughout our neighborhoods to homes to make deliveries. Virtual platforms have been a key part of our ability to engage with our freight industry. I mentioned we did July and September meetings. July was in person and September was virtual, and we definitely saw an uptick in the number of folks who were able to join us. From a land use planning perspective, we've heard from some of our partners on unfriendly land use regulations that can impact freight industry developments and operations. So where they can develop, where trucks can freely access, truck restrictions on the roadways, whether they're formal or informal. We've talked to some folks about some of the road diet strategies and use of roundabouts to discourage truck movements in areas, even if they're not restricted from operating there. And then just the variability of some of these policies across the region, across different jurisdictions, can complicate a truck that's moving from one side of the region to the other. Next slide. Technology is something that we talked a lot about with folks. Certainly the greater Orlando area and Central Florida is a hub in working to attract high-tech companies. And these new technologies that are being implemented can impact the freight industry from the perspective of how automated they are. We're seeing it being used to provide kind of that real-time information on the availability of truck parking spaces through the state's growing truck parking availability system. We're seeing new digital inventories created. We're seeing lots of time spent on electrification and the charging infrastructure that requires. And all these advancements and enhancements in technology can have a positive impact on freight operations, but they also can require the adaptation of infrastructure. As I mentioned, charging stations, as well as different workforce requirements to operate and service these new technologies. From an economic development standpoint, we heard a continued concern about workforce shortages. We've all seen very low unemployment rates, not only in Florida, but around the country. And we heard from some companies that just really makes the retention strategies that they have all the more important. And then the development of freight-friendly policies and infrastructure investments can really help attract and retain your businesses here in the region that's trying to continue to grow and enhance its economic vitality. Next slide. So I mentioned that we did some surveys. One of the surveys that we did, and I think there's probably some of you who filled this out, was we sent out a survey link that allowed our stakeholders to go and, using a GIS tool, online GIS tool, actually go identify specific locations on the network in Central Florida where there are freight needs or concerns or hotspots. And that's where you see the red dots on this map are the 40 or so locations that were identified by our stakeholders, and you're seeing some of the words that kind of bubbled up to the top the most: traffic, safety, congestion, geometric considerations, large trucks, turn capacities, rail facilities. So lots of good information that we collected from folks on that. Next slide. So moving on from what we heard from our stakeholders, one of the other key tasks that we want to talk about here today was the update to the regional freight network. So we went through a formal designation process to review the system that was there before and to make any necessary changes based on new data, based on new travel patterns, et cetera. So the purpose of the regional freight network is really to identify those key freight corridors in the region and to see how that overlays with your national highway freight network. The National Highway Freight Network, designated by US DOT, provides that network that is eligible for federal funding. And so we want to make sure that we understand how that network connects to and benefits and adds value to the regional freight corridors in Central Florida. The designation itself focused on those roadways that are important both for local and regional movements that do provide the connections to the NHFN and support some of the local planning and investment needs. So what you're doing within your cities or your counties as far as major corridors or through movements or access to major freight activity centers, we want to make sure that we're capturing those. Next slide. So our approach was data-driven, required engineering judgment. We did review all of the local regulations to make sure that we were not designating roadways that were ineligible to be designated as a truck roadway. And then that reasonableness and continuity check. We don't want links kind of out in the middle of nowhere that are not part of the network or unable to connect to it. So you can see the graphic on the right just really focuses on kind of how we reached the network that we did, evaluating the data, refining as necessary, making adjustments and validating. And part of that is through capturing input from you all as well, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Next slide. So the network that you see on the map here is the draft regional freight network. It's a 4-tiered system. We ranked them 1, 2, 3, 4 based on the criteria that we applied, with red kind of being the most critical, most important, all the way down to your tier 4, which are shown as yellow, which provide more of the connections to our businesses. This network supports the freight movement, economic development, as well as market access. And it also helps prioritize freight funding. So if you're looking for some of those projects that fall on this network that is red, a tier 1, then that could be given more points in the MTP's ranking process. Next slide. So having this network is nice, but how are we going to use it? So I mentioned the National Highway Freight Network. That's a network that there are some components of it can be redesignated on a regular basis. And so why would you do that? You would do that to make your project eligible for federal funding. So if you have a project that you got federal funding on and it's complete, then you can kind of de-designate that and redesignate another project to another link to bring on to make it eligible for a new project. It also, as I mentioned, helps with project prioritization considerations, and then also supports a range of future planning activities, whether it be engineering studies or corridor studies or access improvement studies. Alex, do you have your hand up?
Oh, my apologies, Mike. Well done.
Oh, okay. Next slide. All right, so this is our pitch to you all if you haven't already done it. I believe you all were sent an online version of the map or with a listing of all of the segments that are designated. And we're looking to finalize this list to feed into the MTP moving forward. We've asked that you provide your feedback by November 6th. and Alex and his team will follow up via email for with more details on that to kind of give you a final reminder as we move forward. But our next steps are to address any comments that you submit, to finalize our freight needs assessment documentation. So we do have very long tech memo currently in the review phase, and then to incorporate the findings and highlights from this, particularly as it relates to potential improvement projects that benefit freight mobility into the 2050 MTP as it moves forward to its adoption. Thank you. Any questions?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but there is one hand raised. Arturo, you're recognized.
Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. Thank you. I was looking at the map for the truck corridors, and there are some places like in between counties where all of a sudden the line stops. And I was wondering why is that, or if it's just a missed opportunity or what. There was a slide that had all the like 6 different versions of this map or 6 different views. Or
Yes.
if not, you can if you can zoom in between Osceola and Orange County on the east side.
Unfortunately, we can't zoom in via this platform.
Oh, okay.
But I think, Arturo, if you have specific questions about certain areas, then
Yeah,
that's
like
something we can follow
532.
up with you.
532 here in Nova Road. It does extend to 520. So I don't know why is that piece missing.
Okay.
And there are others, but yeah, if you want to talk offline, we can do that.
Okay, we certainly can talk offline, I'm sure, if that would be helpful for you. And I think a detailed description of what is on the network was provided by MetroPlan staff. And if there's areas that are just missing, we're more than happy to chat with you about it and review our data as to why it wasn't included. And if it needs to be added, that's what the review process is for.
Yeah, that's good. Now, I had also a question regarding the streetlight data that you guys use to determine the truck volumes.
Sure.
Did you compare any of that to the DOT traffic counts that has truck counts as well?
I'm going to ask Haitao, my colleague, to answer that question if he could.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I can kind of address that question. So we streetlight data is kind of the data that we use for comparison for the validation part of the process, and we primarily use the FDOT truck ADT, and then kind of a data comparison with streetlight data.
Okay, so you did do that. Okay, good.
And additional information about the freight network was included in everyone's agenda packets, along with a couple other handouts for other items on the agenda today. But if there are items just like that, Arturo, we will follow up with you following today's meeting so we can get your feedback and incorporate it into the document. So thank you so much, Mike. We really appreciate you going over the freight element of the plan and where we are with the draft network. Now we're going to switch over to the next item on our agenda, which is the integration of health in transportation planning, presented by Kurt Ostrodka. Kurt, I'll hand it over to you.
If you could go to the next slide, please. Good afternoon, everyone. There's 3 main items that we're going to cover today. First being the literature review, second being stakeholder engagement, and then third, how we brought that together into recommended strategies to better integrate health into the transportation planning process. Next, please. All right, we'll start with our literature review. So first and foremost, we started with the 2022 MetroPlan Orlando Health Strategic Plan. This sets the framework for how health could be incorporated into transportation planning. And one of the key goals of the 2050 MTP was to incorporate that more formally into the MTP. We also reviewed community health improvement plans that are prepared by the departments of health for each of our respective counties, as well as a number of other local plans. And then finally, we reviewed what is called PLACES data, which is published by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which provides health data at the census tract level. Next, please. So some of the key findings when we look at all of this data together was that there are a number of significant disparities, particularly amongst our underserved communities. Notably higher rates of infant mortality and low birth weights, prevalence of chronic diseases, which I'll show you in just a moment, and then deaths resulting from those chronic diseases. Next, please. So in order to understand where within the three-county region the conditions were most concerning, we used that CDC places data that I mentioned before to do some mapping. And what we did is we selected essentially the top 5 census tracts for each of the 3 counties, so we could have an understanding of geographically where some of the greatest health disparities are. We did this for 6 different chronic diseases that are associated with transportation and the built environment. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to show you, we have 2 maps of each, and this one shows prevalence at crude rates for asthma and coronary heart disease. And if you can look closely at the little blue lines around each of the census tracts, that is where those top 5 census tracts are within each of the counties. I'll provide a summary of the neighborhoods at the end. If you'll go to the next slide, you'll start to see a pattern. This is diabetes and high blood pressure. Again, those highlighted census tracts. You can see them in the red areas on generally the west side of Orange County, around Sanford, and then in the urbanized areas of Osceola. If you go to the next one, please. Here we have obesity prevalence as well as high cholesterol prevalence. And if you go to the next one, please. So we've in the technical memorandums, we've summarized each of the census tracts, the prevalence of disease observed, and it does tend to be clustered around the urbanized areas within our Metroplan Orlando area. So West Orange County, which you can see from the maps, the West Orlando neighborhoods like Paramore, Sanford, Longwood, Wekiva Springs, and generally within Seminole County. And then in Osceola County, it's St. Cloud, Kissimmee, and the Buenaventure Lakes area. If you go to the next slide, please. Next, we worked with a number of stakeholder groups. We worked with the departments of health for each of the 3 counties, and then other organizations like American Lung Association, American Heart Association, the Health Council of East Central Florida, as well as the City of Orlando. Next, please. We had 2 online visioning meetings with our stakeholders. The first one, we used a visioning method known as the Oregon model to ask for their input on 3 questions: where are we now, where are we going, and then how do we get there? What is it that we want to achieve? We then each asked all of our stakeholders to provide their input on what kind of health strategies related to transportation would have the greatest impact, and created over 60 different strategies. At our second meeting, we brought them back and we used what's called a priority bullseye exercise, where we asked them to take their different strategies and drag them into the center if it was a high priority type of strategy, into the middle if it was medium, or if it was something that actually was an idea but not a great priority, to put it in the low. And we did this across the 5 different goals of the 2022 Health Strategic Plan that MetroPlan Orlando created. So we wanted to continue that framework, but add some fresh ideas to it from stakeholders. If you go to the next slide, please. So some of the things we heard, a lot of concern about extreme heat and the need for shelters and protection. This was a new topic that wasn't discussed before, but as we've seen a great amount of need for this, and some cities throughout the country are even establishing chief heat officers to deal with new, better understood impacts of extreme heat. Our stakeholders told us about the need for improved education awareness efforts around safety, looking at accessibility, convenience, and affordability of transportation to healthcare. And then, of course, about being mindful of land use decisions where you can co-locate transportation and population. Next, please. So the third part of this is we took the findings from our literature review, we took the findings and recommendations from our stakeholder groups, as well as other information that's being generated in the 2050 MTP process. We had about 160 strategies identified initially, and then we're able to consolidate that down into a more manageable number. So I'd like to show you some of the example strategies that are being recommended as part of the MTP going forward. If you go to the next, please. And next again, please. Okay, so there are 5 strategies included in the, 5 goals in the 2022 MTP, Health Strategic Plan that we are carrying forward. So using that framework, we used our stakeholder input and our literature review to create new strategies for the MTP. So one of those in regards to supporting healthy lifestyles, an example of one of the strategies was encouraging the use of micromobility options, understanding that not everyone has access to transit or owns a personal vehicle, but still has a need to, say, go to a doctor's office. Next, please. Goal 2, implementing healthy transportation infrastructure. The example I want to show here is related to heat exposure, which was a very important topic for our stakeholders. So we wrote some new strategies to address this. Next, please. The third goal is providing a safe transportation system. And one of the key points here is enhanced safety coordination. And the concept here that our stakeholders gave us was to extend programs that are similar to the safe routes to school, but use it for a health-related type of option. So a safe route to a doctor's office, an accessible route to a medical facility. Next, please. Goal 4, improving health care access through transportation. One of the ideas that our stakeholders had was to look at the expansion of what are called independent transportation networks, or ITNs. These are typically faith-based organizations that help provide door-to-door care for elderly individuals. And this could be expanded to help people to get to their doctor's appointments, since transportation is one of the barriers that prevents people at times from getting to doctor's appointments. Next, please. And finally, the 5th goal of the health part of this is integrating health equity into transportation planning. And this is where, again, we would like to formalize the findings and recommendations from that 2022 Health Strategic Plan by implementing and integrating what's called the Planning and Analysis of Transportation and Health Strategies, or PATHS framework, into the 2050 MTP. Next, please. So in order to understand whether or not any recommendations are making a measurable impact. We're also recommending a number of different monitoring and measurement techniques. The one that we will describe here is during every 5-year update of the MTP, go back and review that CDC Places data to see if the same populations and census tracts are still overburdened by chronic diseases. There's in addition to that, partnering with community-based organizations to understand their health input. And then the intent is that when the prioritization process, which I know we're going to talk about later, is being considered, that health is one of those considerations for prioritization. And if you go to the next one. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised at the moment or anything in the chat for you, Kurt. So thank you very much for your presentation. And we'll go ahead on to our next topic. So that is moving over to our housing and transportation strategies, which will be presented by Jared Jones. Jared?
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Jared Jones and happy to be here providing this update today and can get started on the next slide. So for some background, in 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act required metropolitan planning organizations to consider housing in the long-range transportation planning process. And as the first update since that bill, the 2050 MTP will include a housing element for the first time. And can go on to the next slide, please. So the components of this element include a literature review of best practices, stakeholder outreach, recommendations, and of course these technical workshops. We can get into those on the next slide. So we reviewed a wide range of local, state, and long-range transportation plans from across the country that addressed housing. And I won't list those all for the sake of time, but can talk about the findings on the next slide. So some of the key themes from here was the integration of housing data, affordable housing and housing in general near transit and jobs, zoning reforms, increasing choices for housing and transportation options, and as well as a few other themes that we can see in the strategies that will be presented at the end. We can move on to the next slide. So we conducted a series of stakeholder interviews with a range of technical experts, from local planners to housing authority staff members, and from professionals from organizations directly related and tangentially related to housing, such as the Regional Planning Council and AARP. Can continue on to the next slide. So the technical memorandum, which is currently in a draft state, is comprised of a housing context, data analysis, and of course the strategies, which also are the outline of the remaining slides. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So as this is the first housing element for the MTP, we thought it was important to kind of provide a snapshot of where the region is in regards to housing and how we've got here. So of course, there's an ongoing housing affordability crisis affecting the region and the state and country broadly. There's a number of local initiatives to alleviate that crisis and more generally to integrate transportation and land use planning. There's the land use regulatory system is also complex and disjointed, and part of that is due to the inherent complexity in land development, but also from major shifts in the land use statutes governing Florida's municipalities over the decades, and kind of some of the pitfalls of traditional Euclidean zoning, which is common across the state. which of course results in significant separation between homes, jobs, and transit. And there's also an ongoing movement to support zoning reform. Many local governments are updating their comprehensive plans to adopt some of these reforms. There's also state initiatives such as the Live Local Act preemption that enables housing on commercial lands. There's growing federal support, especially through HUD's Pathways to Removing Obstacles to Housing grant, or pro-housing. And then industry initiatives as well, namely the American Planning Association in 2024 made locally supported zoning reform its one and only legislative priority. And we can move on to the next slide. So part of this technical memorandum included data analysis, which looked at employment, land use, environmental, and transit data. I identified opportunity areas where there's an imbalance between jobs and housing. However, this analysis is not intended to serve as a guide for transportation or land use decisions, but instead inform the housing coordination process discussions. We have drafted this analysis and these strategies to support local control and the established comprehensive planning process here in Florida, and to respect Metro Plan Orlando's capabilities when it comes to land use decision. We can move on to the next slide. So the housing strategies are grouped into these 5 theme areas, which we call desired outcomes, and each of these has some discussion on the following slides. So I won't read these off here, but we can move on to the next slide, please. So this first desired outcome area is context-sensitive transportation and land use planning. And this really sets up the framework for implementation of the following strategies through a continued regional housing and transportation coordination process that aims to establish an ongoing body to coordinate housing and transportation decisions. It doesn't identify Metro Plan as the lead agency, but does promote the establishment of that working group. It also promotes the use of context-sensitive planning tools. These are tools that directly tie land use and transportation planning together. For example, the local roadway context classification system that's being supported by FDOT. We're also proposing the local zoning reform assessments, which encourages municipalities to evaluate those contemporary zoning reforms and how appropriate they are for those for their own communities. Again, respecting that local control local jurisdictions have over their own land use decisions. We can move on to the next slide. So this theme area is strong and dynamic housing markets in which we promote flexible zoning standards, parking reforms, and innovative alternatives to the traditional way of managing parking, promoting multi-use zoning and future land use district, and promote regional collaboration to foster a strong local ecosystem of community-based builders. Next slide, please. So inclusive and equitable housing markets, not only do we need a strong housing market, but it needs to be inclusive. And so namely through increasing the supply of affordable homes, especially near transit and jobs, and to promote strategies which minimize the displacement of existing residents and businesses to maintain communities and community characters as places change over time. Next slide, please. So housing security and ending homelessness, obviously a pressing topic with recent legislative policies. We're proposing promoting evidence-based housing first policies that prioritizes getting people into homes and then providing treatment and additional services. Promoting a regionally coordinated crisis response system, and promoting access to stable housing and services through reliable and efficient transportation options. Next slide, please. The final theme area is about housing form and development form, which is really about the physical characteristics of development, which is again managed by local governments through their land development codes and comprehensive plans. We promote the connective development standards, standards that promote buildings to be oriented to the public realm and to support multimodal transportation options, and also policies that advance crime prevention through environmental design, as well as age-friendly and accessible communities. Next slide, please. So as a recap, we're proposing this process, which can be a regional shift through proactive planning that really leverages the momentum behind the zoning reform movement and aims to address a number of pressing concerns related to housing and transportation planning. It emphasizes and respects local control over land use decisions and works within existing planning frameworks. And it supports and builds upon numerous local, state, and regional efforts. Next slide, please. Yes, happy to answer any questions anyone may have.
Thank you so much, Jared. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask that anyone who does have questions for Jared to go ahead and place those questions into the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll circle back to those at the end of the meeting in our open discussion section. And I have seen a few questions float in about the freight element as well as our health discussion. So we will be circling back to those if you haven't already received a response via the Q&A box or the chat pod. So thank you so much, Jared. So with that, we are going to talk through the next item on our agenda, which is an update on the financial resources estimations by Mike Votto. Mike?
Sure. Thanks, Taylor. Just confirming you can still hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Mike Votto from Kimley Horn. Pleasure to be with you all here this afternoon. Here to provide a update on the status of the financial resources / revenue forecasting task for the 2050 MTP. Next slide, Taylor. Had previously presented to this group back during the August workshop, but and had also shared this slide at that time. But just as a recap reminder, and for those of you that may not have joined us previously, just important to reemphasize financial resources and its importance to the development of the 2050 MTP. So the MTP is required to have a financial plan. Then it includes funds that can be reasonably available or assumed to be reasonably available to support the implementation of the plan. This will indicate funds from public and private sources. The technical memo that accompanies the forecast has discussion on additional financing strategies, including discretionary funding opportunities. And that the MTP has to be fiscally constrained. So basically, this is guidance for the development of the cost feasible plan to inform and guide what projects can be paid for over the course of the planning horizon. So that's just a little bit of the background on what this effort was all about. Next slide, Taylor. So a big portion of the funds available for the development of the MTP are those federal and state revenue sources. And so every 5 years, FDOT provides those forecasts to the MPOs throughout the state in the 2050 Revenue Forecast Handbook, which is depicted on screen there. So the handbook includes MPO level revenue estimates that are specific to Metro Plan Orlando. We'll get into those a little bit. District-wide revenue estimates, now those are available to, in our case, District 5, but those funds are programmed in consultation between the district and the MPOs, and then The guidebook also has statewide level revenues, but those are generally included for informational purposes. Next slide, Taylor. So mostly critical to the 2050 MTP is this table shown here, which is a summary of the MPO or Metro Plan Orlando level revenue forecast included in the 2050 revenue forecast handbook. So the revenues shown here on screen, these are for sources over which Metro Plan Orlando has more direct programming responsibility as it relates to the development of the MTP. And as you can see in the period between 2031 and 2050, these sources total nearly $1.7 billion for that planning period. Just a kind of real quick rundown of these sources. STBG or the SU urban funds for Metro Plan Orlando. These are flexible funds that are used to best address state and local transportation needs. The transportation alternatives, or TALU, these are generally for projects associated with pedestrian and bicycle facilities, trails, safe routes to school. The carbon reduction urbanized funds, those are, I guess, generally newer as it relates to the new IIJA transportation bill. So these are funds that can be used to assist MPOs with projects that are designed to reduce transportation emissions from on-road sources. State highway system, kind of self-explanatory, but those are for funds for improvements on the state highway system. Other roads here, non-SIS and non-SHS, these are federal and state funds that may be used what's called off-system. So these are roads that are not on the strategic intermodal system or the state highway system. So in other words, roads that are owned by our counties and local municipalities. And then non-SIS transit formula. These are state revenues for technical and operating and capital assistance for transit, paratransit, commuter assistance programs rather. But these funds are coordinated with FDOT and each respective transit agency. Next slide. So as I had mentioned previously, there are those district-wide revenue forecasts that are also provided in the revenue forecast handbook from FDOT. So this table summarizes those funds estimated to be available to District 5 through 2050. So you'll see similar programs that I described on the previous slide, but again, these funds are available district-wide. And then there's, so that would be the Surface Transportation Block Grant, Transportation Alternatives, described those previously. TRIP is the Transportation Regional Incentive Program. Again, these are shown at the district-wide level. This program encourages regional planning by providing state matching funds for improvements on regionally significant transportation facilities. So in the MTP, projects that might be anticipated to use TRIP can be included, but those are usually shown as illustrative, again, because these are district-wide funds. There's non-capacity programs that are included at the district-wide level. So that's the Highway Safety Improvement Program, which is managed by the FDOT Safety Office. And resurfacing, bridge and operations and maintenance, again, district-wide funds available to maintain the state highway system at the district level. And then similarly, there's discretionary transit funds available at the district-wide level too. So on the next slide, we have estimated allocations to Metro Plan Orlando for the SA funds, which could be used any area in District 5, and the TAL, which are transportation alternatives funds that can be used any area within the district. So this estimated allocation to Metro Plan Orlando, this has been developed for planning purposes and in conjunction with the other other MPOs within District 5 through a collaborative effort and using a population projection methodology. And so that was facilitated through the Central Florida MPO Alliance, so that for these particular funds, each of the MPOs within District 5 would have a reasonable figure to work with for their respective planning processes that they're also going through at this time. So here what's depicted is those total revenues for the district in that second column, and then the portion of that which would be used for planning purposes that would be estimated to be allocated to Metro Plan Orlando. And next slide. So as we shared in our previous update during the last workshop, we also worked with our local government partners, primarily our 3 counties, to identify funding sources and revenue projections for those funds that the counties use to fund transportation improvements. So these include gas taxes, infrastructure sales tax, impact fees, mobility fees, and allocations from their respective general fund. And we'll talk about here on the subsequent slides. We also worked with the appropriate departments at the counties to obtain illustrative forecasts that were based on assumptions of some future sources being enacted. So next slide, Taylor. So shown here on the screen are the total projected revenues, again, in that 20-year planning horizon from 2031 to 2050 for our 3 counties. And again, these figures are shown in year of expenditure. So a inflation factor provided by FDOT in the revenue forecasting guidebook was applied to these figures. Because without getting too much into the cost feasible planning process, but project costs will be assigned inflation factors, so that available funding and project costs match up in all those future years. That inflation factor is applied here, so those numbers are reflecting that. Again, these are existing sources. So in the case of Osceola County, this figure here assumes the sunset of the infrastructure sales tax in 2045. And for Seminole County, this figure does not assume the renewal of the infrastructure sales tax later this year. But on the following slide, the illustrative revenues basically include those assumptions. So we have that second column shows the existing revenues, or the projections based on existing revenues from the previous slide, and then the illustrative figure there on the right. So in the case of Orange County, this assumes the potential passing and enactment of a 1% transportation surtax at the earliest in 2026. And again, this is for illustrative purposes. And then Osceola County, this assumes the continuation of the infrastructure sales tax, after 2045. And then in the case of Seminole County, this assumes the renewal later this year of the infrastructure sales tax in Seminole and projects through 2050. You have to pardon me for 1 second. Sorry about that, excuse me. So we also documented other revenues and planned expenditures within the region. So these next few slides are so that in the MTP we're capturing the investments being made on through other venues, through other systems on the network. But these are generally incorporated into the MTP by reference. So in this case, it's the strategic intermodal system. These planned improvements would be incorporated by reference in the MTP. Information that we've documented is based on the SIS adopted second 5-year plan and the newly released 2050 SIS COTS feasible plan. And based on that information, again, for informational purposes here, expected expenditures between 2031 and 2050 are around $3.6 billion on the strategic intermodal system, and that's for projects on I-4, State Road 46, and State Road 60. And we also looked at the tolled facilities here in the region. So Florida's Turnpike, similarly, those planned improvements will be incorporated by reference in the MTP. This is based on the 10-year major project list for our 3 counties as provided by the Turnpike, and expected expenditures on projects funded through construction during that time is over $800 million, and this includes widenings of the Turnpike main line and State Road 417, and that's a capacity additions of capacity, not including any resurfacing projects. Similarly, next slide, Taylor. Similar exercise that we undertook with CFX. Again, these improvements would be incorporated by reference in the MTP based on information in CFX's 5-year work plan. And basically, we kind of just did a little summary here of totals in the work plan, more than $4 billion. But based on their 2045 master plan, there's a certain number of more than $20 million in project investments, but funding capacity around $12 billion. So again, this is for informational purposes, and CFX, they work on their 5-year work plan schedule and to determine the cost feasibility of these projects and funding options for those projects that are identified in their master plan. And next slide. And we also worked with our transit partners to identify total projected revenues, again, through that 20-year planning period. So we worked with Lynx to develop these estimates based on their most recent 10-year financial plan included in their transit development plan. And similarly, working with Sunrail, we identified total projected revenues for that same period of more than $2 billion, but noting that a portion of these projected revenues assume the local support forthcoming through that new agreement by partner counties and cities. And this slide just includes a summary of the sources that shared previously. So this includes those federal and state funds, as well as the county funding sources. This excludes CIS and the Turnpike and CFX and so on and so forth, to kind of give a general picture of the funding available to fund the 2050 MTP shown here. And this will all be provided in the technical memo that's currently in draft phase. And again, these funds will be used for the next phase of developing the cost feasible plan. So next slide, Taylor. So as I mentioned, we're finalizing the source Excel tables that we use for the development of this. The technical memorandum is in draft format. We'll be finalizing that in the coming weeks. And like I mentioned, the revenues summarized here will be used in the development of the cost feasible plan. And that's all I have, and you'll have to excuse me.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike. I do see we had a couple questions come in. Unfortunately, we are running a little behind on time right now, so anyone with their hand raised, I do ask that you put your question into the chat or the Q&A box for right now, and we'll be able to circle back to those after our last presentation today. So thank you so much, Mike, and thank you everyone who's attending today with your patience and flexibility with the time management. So with that, the last topic on our agenda for discussion today is the prioritization process and the draft prioritization methodology, which will be presented by Matt Miller. Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Taylor. Hi, my name is Matt Miller, and I'm glad to introduce myself. I'm a senior associate with Cambridge Systematics, and I'm glad to be here today to provide you with an introduction to some of the latest developments involving the 2050 MTP project prioritization process. Our approach to prioritizing transportation projects for the 2050 MTP is rooted in a data-driven analysis, considering the specific context of the Orlando metropolitan region. This multimodal approach will help us ensure that we address some of the key goals and objectives. And this method will be applied into the needs assessment, which examines all potential projects, both on and off the state highway system, creating a comprehensive list of regional needs. These projects will then inform the development of the 2050 MTP's cost feasible plan. Some of the key steps include goal area weighting, developing evaluation criteria, and then scoring those criteria. Next slide, please. This slide is highlighting some of the differences between the 2045 and 2050 prioritization processes. The primary source of new evaluation criteria identified and included are from a series of studies and plans which took place in the interim between 2045 and 2050. They include the likes of the critical sidewalk studies, the Vision Zero Central Florida Safety Plan, Active Transportation Plan, and TISMO Plan. So those are some of the source materials. Another key aspect in defining the differences is that driving the 2050 project prioritization process update is that in 2045 MTP, modal categories like TISMO, complete streets, and bike pedestrian projects were individually prioritized. However, the global prioritization method used for the state highway system, with that, projects often resulted in fewer active transportation projects being funded, as they didn't score as high in terms of benefits. So for the 2050 MTP, a more nuanced approach is being applied where modal categories get divided into smaller, more specific programs, each with their own scoring. For example, instead of one broad regional bicycle program, prioritization processes and scoring are going to be allocated now to distinct categories like active transportation, trails, and critical sidewalks. So we'll be showing some of those in the applicability of evaluation criteria within the goal areas in the next coming slides. One additional mention is the safety category tied to Vision Zero. Now is reflected within these evaluation criteria as well as within its own modal program type. So just wanted to highlight that. Next slide, please. So a goal weighting survey was developed in the previous technical meeting with noted responses here that indicate some of the preferred weighting for each of the goal areas. These goal areas will be incorporated through scoring thresholds for each of the evaluation criteria that are going to sit within each goal area. So I know this is a little bit of a long sentence, but in this way, some of the goal areas and their definitions will inform the prioritization process. So the evaluation criteria and all the 9 modal program types were applicable. Next slide. This is going to take a 4-step approach to the evaluating criteria. First step was goal weighting, and we've already accomplished that. Step 2, I guess I should say that's proposed goal weighting, so there might be some additional inputs and feedback around it. But step 2 is to include evaluation criteria based on review of some of the 2045 MTP evaluation criteria, as well as the subsequent modal program studies, which I mentioned before. Next slide. Step 3 involves updating range and scoring metrics in a way that really aligns with all of the 9 modal program types listed here. And so step 4 is taking those review of the proposed draft evaluation criteria for their applicability to these 9 mode program types. And so it's really kind of an interchange between step 3 and 4, which we're in the middle of right now. But each project prioritization score will be tallied according to the applicable evaluation criteria. So each modal program type effectively gets its own score and its own list of applicable evaluation criteria. So next slide, please. So this slide really is aimed to show the 3 proposed safety evaluation criteria and walk you through how some of the applicability was assigned to this at first internally, but now for your review as well. So I believe there's a survey link that's contained within the agenda packet. So we would very much like your input on how we've done some of the applicability here and to gather some feedback there. So if you could advance this slide. So you can see we have applicable, not applicable. This will carry out across the mode types. mode and program types. So you can see as we develop this and go through them, some of them fall off, but by and large, the safety remains pretty consistent across. So yes, so that shows you effectively how we're doing some of the applicability, and then how we're going to tie that to some of the scoring that comes off of those that are nested within each of the program mode types. Next slide. This provides the reliability evaluation criteria. Most mode program types here are applicable with the exception of critical sidewalks, active transportation, and trail projects. Again, we welcome your input on whether you feel these are correct in that they've been effectively the NA has been applied to critical sidewalks, active transportation, but it is applicable for the rest. Travel time reliability investments would not apply to critical sidewalks, and this is the logic, as you know, active transportation investments and trail projects. Fiber optic presence would apply to safety in that it enables quicker traffic incident management and traveler information system alerts to downstream traffic, preventing crashes. While travel time reliability and evacuation route designation is much more directly connected to the spine of ITS and investments in associated transportation systems management and operations. So next slide. This is for connectivity and goal areas using evaluation criteria aimed at ensuring transportation user needs are met by various user groups. So that can be estimated by geospatial analysis. Some of the denser populations within half-mile of the non-transit corridor show gaps in the transit network and potential ridership base. Jobs within 1/2 mile of the non-transit corridor, as well as cultural and recreational locations, food and healthcare. We are now being more inclusive as far as schools go. We're including universities and vocational training centers. So a bit more of an expansion of some of the evaluation criteria are tucked into these, and they'll be shown and explained further. I believe in the agenda packet has greater detail on each of these. All the measures concerning land use and demographics data are alongside transit and roadway assets. So not as applicable to safe routes to school in this case, but TSMO intersection and other TSMO projects. Next slide. Okay, and then in the discussions we had in the alignment and development of community goal areas, considered simplifying and combining existing measures. So we had a strong emphasis on improving safety and pedestrian conditions for this goal area and the associated evaluation criteria. We wanted to integrate measures tied to jurisdictional significance as a community measure, as well as transportation underserved communities. And the community evaluation criteria includes public health indicators, change in AADT, jurisdictional significance, and presence of transportation in underserved communities. Many are not applicable to state highway system projects and TSMO projects, so you'll see some of those fall off in that case. Jurisdictional significance was moved. It was initially in prosperity, but now we've moved it into community. Next slide, please. And then finally, last but not least, prosperity. There are really 7 evaluation criteria in prosperity. Initially, we had a lot more, but through some of the initial considerations, we've effectively realigned them. Discussions tied to modal program applicability and location within this goal area really centered on access to jobs, essential services, and educational opportunities. And these criteria were really decided to be placed within the connectivity goal area. So as mentioned before, which reduced the number of this from 11 down to 7. So ultimately, these criteria are really aimed at freight, considering commercial land use, accounting for cost-burdened households, recreational visitors, use of the network, and then the overall congestion costs. Safe routes to school was not among the most applicable mode program types, except in the case of cost-burdened households, which do apply across almost all except the SHS project types. Next slide, please. So as referenced before, a link to this survey is included in the workshop packet, and we encourage you to please take it as soon as you can so we can go through and analyze your input and feedback as to how these have effectively been connected to the goal areas and the associated weights. As you're aware, this will ultimately connect to the scoring and the thresholds, which will be informing some of the project prioritization processes. And then, so as part of this survey, please review those criteria to ensure they are still aligned from your perspective with the overall goals and objectives. And this will help us ensure that the criteria are appropriate and they have not become outdated or misaligned. If you add, remove, or relocating criteria may enhance the accuracy. So we are looking for any input feedback specific to that. And if you feel like some factors are not being addressed, we certainly welcome that as well. The modal program type question here is really helping us to identify whether each criteria is applicable to all modes or specific ones. And one of the key differences between 2045 and 2050 is the separation of projects along 9 modal program types. And so this question is really going to help us ensure how the prioritization process remains fair and accurate as we include this new update to the process and the mechanism for how it's done. Next slide, please. So again, this is reiterating some of those some of the next steps for where we're going to carry this the project prioritization process task and the updates. So we're looking at identifying some of those thresholds, finalizing them, getting them into a scoring and a criteria application across different modes. And then some of the survey responses are expected, which we expect to include and address as we move into the next phase of this project. And your feedback is much appreciated in advance, and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Matt, for walking us through the prioritization process and the first draft methodology with the evaluation criteria. I have seen several questions come in through the chat, and I'm going to guess that there's a few more that are ready to have their hands raised now that we're here in our open discussion period. So I will go back and start with those early questions that we received and hadn't quite been able to get to in regards to some of our prior presentations, and then we'll make it back to the prioritization questions. So beginning with the freight question, there was a question about the technical memo that was referenced during the presentation by Mike. That technical memo that was referenced was included as an attachment in your agenda packet, and we can follow up with that additional information in a follow-up email after this meeting as well. So you've got everything you need to be able to provide your feedback on that draft freight network. And thank you, Sarah Larson, for being able to respond to those 2 questions in the Q&A chat from Arturo. So Arturo, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to let us know. Then Mike, there was a question for the financial resources estimations. Was Osceola County's newly adopted mobility fee considered for the projected local revenue for Osceola County?
So I will say, Josh, that what we put together was based on coordination with county staff prior to the adoption of those, but we will circle around with the budget and finance staff just to confirm whether the assumptions were assuming the new rates or if we just have to revisit that. But to answer succinctly, these were put together prior to the final adoption.
Okay, thank you. I saw a thumbs up come across the screen. So the next question, we're coming back to prioritization now. I haven't seen any other ones come through. The first was a quick item about the SurveyMonkey link. So I apologize, there was a minor typo on the slide. The link to be able to reach the draft prioritization methodology survey is included in the chat, and it's also included in its entirety on the first page of your agenda packet, but also in the latter portion of your agenda packet in the prioritization methodology memo that was provided to you for your review. So there are some handouts for you to be able to look into that as well. So then our next and last question that I see in the queue as of right now, Matt, and this maybe when we tag team, how are we defining and distinguishing the active transportation projects into these multiple categories?
Right, so I guess in my first responsibility, we basically pulled the evaluation criteria tied to active transportation from that plan directly, and as well as the critical sidewalk analysis. So a lot of the evaluation criteria that are integrated into this as a draft posed criteria for the goal areas, they will effectively be used to drive scoring that sits across all of active transportation, multimodal, sidewalk, and trail. But I believe the definitions are going to be inherent within the studies themselves. Is that correct, Taylor?
Yes. So this is where you're seeing a lot of the elements that we're working on in parallel starting to come together as we get ready for the infrastructure investment scenario planning we'll be doing next calendar year. So the needs assessment work that we're doing right now, and Kelly, I believe we've got our final draft meeting already scheduled with your team. If not, I'll follow up with you to make sure that's on the calendar. But we're looking at all of the needs from those multimodal perspectives. We'll have general active transportation projects, sidewalk projects, trail projects. These prioritization methods are going to provide us with opportunities to be able to look at each of those projects independently rather than trying to compare and decide is a trail more important than a sidewalk, or is a sidewalk more important than the bike lane. This gives us more flexibility in terms of the future scenarios that we'll be evaluating. Are there any other questions about any of the topics that we've had thus far for any of our presenters? Or for me, if you have questions about the MTP in general?
Taylor, we had another question in chat from Philip from Winter Springs, whether the presentation would be made available after the meeting.
Oh, thank you, Alex. I missed that one. My apologies, Phil. The presentation is actually already, nope, it hasn't been published just yet. It will be published online by Monday at the latest, so you'll be able to have it in its entirety. A recording of this presentation will also be published directly to our YouTube channel, and once both of those items are up and available on our website, I will be sending you a follow-up email with direct links to be able to access all of these materials. But everything in your agenda packet that we're asking for your feedback on, all of that is included in the calendar invitation you received for this meeting today. Are there any other questions, items that we would like to discuss as a group? Okay, not seeing any hands go up or new items in the chat or Q&A items. We'll go ahead and move forward into our public comment section. Is there any member of the public who has a question or comment that they would like to make today? If so, please go ahead and use the raise your hand feature to indicate that you would like to speak. And not seeing any hands raised here either. We'll go ahead and close that portion of the meeting and talk about our next steps. So wrapping up today's meeting, there are a few items that we want to make sure that were summarized here for you to keep them top of mind. First, we ask that each of you submit your feedback on the draft prioritization evaluation criteria via the survey link by next Monday, October 21st. And that you also review the draft freight network and provide your feedback on that by November 6th. And then our last item is a little reminder for our local agencies. Thank you to those who have already worked with us to proactively schedule your final draft needs assessment coordination meetings. For those who haven't yet done so, please respond to the invitation email that you received from me so that way we can reserve that time for this very important discussion. The final draft project list will be distributed to your staff to review very soon. And any final thoughts or feedback on that final draft needs assessment will need to be submitted back to our team by November 15th. I want to make sure we all have these dates ready and at the go. So Thank you everyone for your participation in today's workshop. The last session of this year will actually be held on December 12th, again at 2 p.m. in this virtual Zoom space. And the first session of 2025 will be held on February 13th. And you will receive calendar invitations for these two items to reserve the time in your inboxes in the near future. So thank you again to all of you, and we'll be seeing you again soon. Have a great day.